also, what's very interesting is from your childhood even.
Well, you tell me where to start.
Yeah, I would say let's start with the childhood years, like where we were born, the neighborhood, the school. Then from that, you could even talk about your parents, what influence they had on you, and then from that point, you want to take some more thoughts, and then go right into your high school, your adult high school years like that, and how that influenced you to becoming, with the legal background and going into the war. What influenced you to go to World War II? The whole thing like that.
Okay.
Just step by step progression.
I'll keep talking, and if you have any questions, you can interrupt me.
Okay.
Okay, we're rolling anytime you're ready.
My name is Robert Rosenthal. I was born on June 11, 1917 in Brooklyn, New York. My mother's name was Rose. My father's name was Samuel. I had one sister named Jeanette, who was 3 years older than I. In later years, she introduced me as her older brother. But she did that for humorous reasons, I guess. At that time in Brooklyn, it was rather open-spaced and not at all like it is today. We lived on East 21st Street, and there was a goat farm on East 22nd Street and Avenue X. It was not bucolic, but it was a rather laid-back, open kind of area. My father worked as a technician in the New York City Health Department. My sister and mother were musicians. They played the piano, and my uncle was a great piano player. At family gatherings, we would gather around the piano and sing. And I was a monotone, unfortunately, and they kept pushing me further to the rear. But I always loved to sing. As a matter of fact, in high school, I joined the Glee Club. And I was there. I loved singing, but the teacher in charge said, "There's a sour note here somewhere." And when she went around the room listening for the sour note, I just phrased the words and didn't sing. Finally, she caught me, and I was dispelled from the Glee Club. But I loved to sing. I went to public school 215 in Brooklyn. We lived mostly at East 21st Street near Avenue S, which is near James Madison High School. I attended that. I was in the Arista, which is the Honor Society, and graduated there in 1934. And from there I went to Brooklyn College. I attended that. I was a mediocre student there. I was more interested in playing football, and I was captain of the team and enjoying myself. My father died in January of 1941, and things were very tough for us. We lived during the Depression. My family didn't have much money, but we had everything we ever needed. My sister she worked as a designer for Bergdorf Goodman and Hattie Carnegie. When my father died, my mother went to work in the garment trade. I worked all through college. I worked in the cafeteria, I worked in the library. I was a soda jerk. I worked in the hotel during the summers. We had to do it. It was part of our culture. The values I received from my family were to be honest, to be loyal, to be hardworking. And I try to live up to that. When I attended college, there was a course that was given in constitutional law. And that course affected me. It challenged me. And I decided when I graduated that I would like to attend law school. I attended Brooklyn Law School, which was part of St. Lawrence University. I couldn't afford to go during the daytime. I had to work. And I got a job with a very prominent law firm called Paletti, Diamond, Rabin, and Botine. Charles Paletti was the lieutenant governor of the state. Bernie Botine became the chief judge of the appellate division later on, and Ben Rabin was a congressman and a Supreme Court judge later on. And I never had time for myself. We worked 6 days a week, sometimes on Sunday. And I attended 3 summers at night, so I would graduate in 3 years. At that time, I never had time to take notes of the cases that I had to learn. So I memorized everything that I had to do. And it enhanced my ability later on because my memory improved. I was able to grasp facts and retain them. And at that time, there was very little sociability that I would indulge in. Didn't have much money and never had time because I went to school at night, and when that session ended, I went right into the summer program. And during the Depression, 1933, Hitler came into power. And Roosevelt came in around the same time. And Hitler, with his talk of superiority of the Aryan nation and his treatment of Jews, Kristallnacht, where he destroyed Jewish shops and manhandled Jews and incarcerated Jews, affected me deeply. And at that time, there was also a great deal of anti-Semitism in our area, in New York. You had the German-American Bund, which held rallies and had anti-Semitic rallies. And it affected me deeply. But I had a sense of frustration. War, as you recall, Hitler wanted to take Czechoslovakia, and Chamberlain and de Vallier of France met with him in Munich, and they worked out a deal where Germany got half of Czechoslovakia. This was given by Chamberlain, who had no control over Czechoslovakia, gave it to Hitler and claimed that we have peace in our time. Well, a few months later, Hitler took the rest of Czechoslovakia, and England and France decided to declare war. And it was not long before Hitler swept into France, overtook France, and drove the British out of France. And they had that tragedy at Dunkirk, where the British soldiers were ultimately rescued by the British and brought back to the UK. All of that affected me very deeply. And I had a sense of frustration that I couldn't do anything about it. And finally, Pearl Harbor occurred on December 6, 1941. December 7th, 1941. And suddenly, that frustration disappeared. I went down the next day on December 8th and volunteered to be an Air Force cadet. I felt now that I could do something. I had the ability to offer resistance to that regime. And the U.S. was under attack. We had been attacked by the Japanese, and 3 days later, Hitler declared war on us, and Italy declared war on us. So we were involved in a worldwide war. And suddenly the nation came together. We had been split down the middle, people who wanted to help England and those who were America first, who believed that we shouldn't have been in World War I and we shouldn't be in World War II. And there were some groups that were pro-Nazi. But when the attack came on Pearl Harbor, the nation came together. The voices of dissent were silenced. I don't think our nation was ever more strongly united than after Pearl Harbor. And I was sent to Alabama, to Montgomery, Alabama, and they were ill-suited to take care of us at that time. They didn't have much food. I remember eating a lot of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, which I happened to like. And unfortunately, I came down with an athlete's foot. I'd never had that before. And it was so bad they had to hospitalize me. And I was forced to miss one class. I was sent to Douglas, Georgia, where I received my primary training in a single-engine plane. And I soloed after 8 hours. And when I did solo, they tried to wave me in, but I had a sense of freedom. And I kept landing and taking off, landing and taking off. I never enjoyed anything more than I did at that time. And from Douglas, Georgia, well, in Douglas, Georgia, I had an experience that upset me. Each instructor had 4 students. And the other 3 students that my instructor had previous flight training. I had none. I had never been inside of an airplane. And about halfway through the course, my instructor called me over and said I was being assigned to another instructor. And that new instructor had washed out his 4 cadets. And my heart sank. I thought I was going to be washed out because of that instructor. I flew with him, and then I was checked out by the major, the commander of the field, and I passed, and I was authorized to go on to basic training. Little did I know that they were not checking me, they were checking the instructor out, and they washed him out. But my heart sank, and I was very depressed when I went through that situation. I went to Sumter, South Carolina for basic training. And from there I went to Douglas, Georgia for 2-engine training. And there again I had an odd experience. It came time for night flying, instrument flying at night. And I was assigned to a captain who I didn't know. At that time, students would fly in the left seat and the instructor in the right seat. When I went into the plane, the captain told me to sit in the right seat, that he was going to do all the flying. And we took off, and for 2 hours, 2.5 hours, we flew around, and he just circled the field. And when we came in for a landing, the wheels were up. And when the wheels are up and you come in for landing and you pull back on the throttle, a klaxon would sound to warn you that the wheels are up. And I tapped the captain on the shoulder and I said, "The wheels are up." And he just nodded and he landed with the wheels up. And I was brought into the commanding officer and said, "Why did you land with your wheels up?" And I explained that I never flew the plane. And apparently that captain, who was very muscular, he was about 6'3", very strong-looking guy, had folded because he was under stress teaching people how to fly, and they washed him out. So I had these odd experiences which bothered me considerably because I was determined to go on and fly. And they asked us when we graduated, "Would you like to go into training or to combat?" And I said, "Combat." Well, if you're familiar with the military, whatever you asked for, you didn't get. So they sent me into training gunners in air-to-air combat. And this was at Fort Myers, Florida, and we flew from 8 o'clock in the morning to 8 o'clock at night, intermittently. We'd fly for a half an hour, land, and then get a new group. And I compiled a huge amount of flying time. And I really learned how to fly, and I gained confidence in the aircraft. And we, on a rare day off, we would dogfight. So while I was very unhappy about being in the training command, that flying that I did there really helped me when I finally got into combat. And I flew a B-17, and I realized how flyable the B-17 was and what I could do with it. It was a tremendous confidence builder. I went into B-17 training in Florida, and I was sent from there to Peyote, Texas. That's the garden spot of America. We used to sweep our quarters out with a shovel. The wind would blow in all this sand, and it would end up by being 2 inches thick. And for a lark, some of the pilots would buzz the cattle down there, which I never did. I was a very conservative pilot. I never took any chances. From there, we went to Texas. And, no, I'm sorry. From there, we went to Tennessee, Gettysburg, Tennessee, where I picked up my crew. We had 10 people in the crew. We had a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, who were officers, and the engineer, assistant engineer, turret gunner, belly gunner, then the tail gunner, 2 waist gunners, and so forth, and a radio operator. And the crew were a motley group from all over the country, whom I came to respect and admire. And we got along beautifully. And from the first day I joined the military, people called me Rosie. Anybody whose name began with R-O-S-E was instantly called Rosie. And I named my plane Rosie's Riveters. My mother's name was Rose, and there was a song that was very popular at that time called Rosie the Riveter. And it just seemed natural to me to call it that. And from Tennessee, we went to Dayton, and we went to Presque Isle, Maine. From Presque Isle, Maine, we went to Greenland, Iceland, and Scotland. And I landed in England in the summer of 1943. And I was sent to the 100th Bomb Group, which was located at Dis, Thorpe Abbotts. And I remained there until the end of the war. I was into my 3rd tour without going home. I decided that as long as I had the ability to fight the Nazis, I would stay and fight. And I flew until the end of the war. My first mission, we went to Bremen, and our squadron commander was shot down and became a prisoner of war. We had high losses on that mission. My plane, Rosie's Riveters, was badly damaged. and a couple of engines were out, and nobody was injured. And for the second mission, which was the next day, they gave me a different plane to fly called the Royal Flush. The second day, we flew to Nuremberg, Prussia, which was one of the longest flights of the world. It was almost a 9-hour mission. And we were exhausted. We came back and had a little sleep and were awakened the next day, which was a mission to Munster, Germany. Our group was pretty well banged up, and we could only put 13 planes in the air. And we started out, at that time, we only had fighter protection until little beyond the English Channel, because our planes didn't have the capacity for a long mission. And after they left us, we were picked up by German fighters who escorted us into the target. And that, I believe, the mission to Munster was the most intense air battle of the war. We were outnumbered by the fighters. And as we approached the target, a whole group of 109s and 190s swept through our group and ultimately shot down all the others in the group. And my crew was left standing there, and we flew into the target alone and dropped our bombs on the target. And there was a whole covey of German planes above us attacking us. And I did some crazy maneuvers that I had picked up when in the training command. Chandelles and lazy S's. I was all over the sky. So we were not a good target for the Germans. And after maybe 5 or 10 minutes, they abandoned us and went after easier targets. My crew complained that I didn't give them a stable platform so that they could shoot down the German planes. But I think they would have shot down us. They outnumbered us terribly. And there was a rocket hole through our wing. 2 engines were out. Our 2 waist gunners were seriously injured. And one of them, John Schaefer, was sent home with very serious internal injuries. The other, Lauren Darling, returned after recuperation. Members of my crew were Pappy Lewis. He was bald-headed, and they called him the bald eagle, and they called me the legal eagle. And C.J. Milburn was the bombardier. Ronald Bailey was the navigator. C.C. Hall, the engineer. Mike Bocuzzi was the radio operator. Lauren Darling, the waist gunner, as I said before. Ray Robinson, the ball turret gunner, and Bill de Blasio, the tail gunner. They were a great bunch. We stayed together. I came back to the base, and we were the only ones back at the base after that mission. And the place was eerily quiet. Went to the officers' club, and there was nobody there. And at that time, if a crew flew 15 missions, they would send them to what they called the Flak House, which was a beautiful estate somewhere in South England for rest and recreation. I had only flown 3 missions, and they decided to send us off, which was the worst thing that could have happened. We should have flown immediately after that. And went to the Flak House, and all I remember about that was very peaceful. And my navigator asked me if I wanted to play golf. They had a golf course there. And I never played golf before. Brooklyn, we never played golf. And they had sheep ranging over the golf course. And the sheep turds were little round dark things, and the golf balls they had were very old and they were dark. And when we played, we couldn't tell the difference between the golf balls and the turds. And when we tried to hit what we thought was a golf ball, we got splattered. That's all I remember about the flak house. But before we went to the flak house, we were ordered to go to 3rd Bomb Division. Curtis LeMay was the commanding general of the 3rd Bomb Division. In my mind, he was the greatest air commander in the history of aviation. Very tough man, brilliant, determined. And he would sit with a stogie, a cigar butt in his mouth, which was not lit, with a scowl on his face. I ultimately found out the scowl was due to a nerve deformity in his face, that he really was not that much of a scowler. And the people who led the various missions, the Bremen, Nuremberg mission, and the Munster mission, the group commanders, or the people who led those flights, the commanding officers who led those flights, would have to get up and tell what they did. And if they screwed up, LeMay would chew them out. He wanted perfection, and he demanded it, and he got it. And I was very unsophisticated. I had never been to a critique, and I got up and I talked about the Bremen mission, the Marienburg mission, and the Munster mission. And when I finished, he said, "Good work." Now, to me, good work is mediocre, so-so. But at the end of the critique, some commanding officer of another group came over, and he said he'd never heard such lavish praise from Curtis LeMay. And when we returned from the flak house, I started to fly missions again. And we flew 25 missions, which was the first tour. We flew the first missions to Berlin. I ended my tour on March 8th, which was a mission to Berlin. And strangely, we didn't lose a plane on that mission. Before we left, the crew had been through a lot, urged me to buzz the field when we returned. And I, as I said, I was a very conservative pilot, and I said, I don't think so. But on the way back, I said, what the heck? These guys have been through an awful lot. So I let everybody land, and then when everybody was on the ground, I came in with my wheels down, approached the runway, pulled my wheels up, and headed right for the tower where the commanding officers would be, the squadron commanders, to observe the landing. And everybody hit the deck there. And I buzzed the field 3 or 4 times and then came in and went to the debriefing room. And then somebody approached me and said, "Rosie, did you know that General Hugland, the commanding officer of the 13th Bomb Wing, was there at the tower? And he hit the deck and his clothes are all messed up." And I said, "Oh, Rosenthal, you've done it again." And with that, General Hugland approached me, and my heart sank, and he said, "One hell of a buzz job, Rosie." And after that, I received and all of the crew, except one, I think, received the Distinguished Flying Cross for the Munster mission. And in my military career, I have received the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star with cluster, the Distinguished Flying Cross with cluster, 2 Purple Hearts, 11 Air Medals, the British Flying Cross, and the French Croix de Guerre. When my first tour ended, I was assigned to be an assistant operations officer. And as an assistant operations officer, I would fly as a command pilot. I didn't have my own crew. The command pilot would sit on the right seat of a lead crew. The lead crew pilot would actually fly the plane. The command pilot was in charge of his group, making sure that they assembled properly, making sure that they joined with other groups properly, making sure that they joined with the fighters, and if they came to a target that they couldn't bomb because of cloud cover or other conditions, they would have to make a decision whether to go on to another target or return. It was that kind of a responsibility. And also I was put in charge, along with Harry Crosby, the group navigator, of training lead crews, which I enjoyed very much. We ultimately ended up by having a superb group of lead crews. The 100th Bomb Group, when I first joined it, was not a well-disciplined group, unfortunately. Their formation flying was loose. We had a commanding officer who was probably the nicest person you'd ever meet. He couldn't do enough for you. He was courageous and just a wonderful person. But he didn't enforce any rules, and people took advantage of him. The people who served under him took advantage and didn't perform properly, I think. And it was not until a commanding officer named Tom Jeffrey came to the field, sometime I think in April of 1944, did we become a superb group. I think the best group in the Air Force. He was a brilliant commander, charismatic and intelligent, and he just brought the group together. As an example of what his judgment was, we were one of the few groups that dropped supplies to the Maquis, the French Maquis, the French resistant forces. We would drop them supplies of munitions, and they would be dropped in parachutes, white parachutes. And we were assigned to that mission one time, and Jeffrey was leading it. And we peeled off from the stream of bombers who were headed toward a target with real bombs. And as our group peeled off, a plane from another group joined us. There was a rule that if you couldn't stay with your own group, join another group for your protection and drop bombs with them. Well, that plane had bombs in it, and that plane was on a different frequency than our group, so we couldn't contact them. And Jeffrey had the problem of going and dropping our parachutes with the supplies in it, and having that bomber come along, opening his bomb bay doors and dropping bombs, and there would have been an international incident where we would have destroyed the people we were trying to help. But he sent one plane over. He circled the group and sent one of our planes open with the bomb bay doors open, and they dropped the parachutes with the supplies in it. And that bomber, a pilot who had the bombs on plane, saw that, closed his bomb bay doors, and we all uttered a sigh of relief. I thought that was rather brilliant that he did that sort of thing. And I remember flying as command pilot on a mission to Berlin with a pilot named Kincannon. He was a lead pilot. And it was a little incident that occurred, but apparently we were hit over the target and the oil drained out of one engine. And it drained out suddenly, and we couldn't feather the engine. and the engine froze. And instead of the propeller turning, the whole engine turned. And it was vibrating so much, the plane threatened to fall apart. So I dove the plane, pushing the throttles forward, and then suddenly pulled up and cut back on the throttles, and I managed to crack the I can't remember the term anymore, that the propeller was spinning on. And it was rotating wildly and causing a drag on the plane. So I once again went through the same maneuver, pulled up again, and this time the propeller shot out and cut the propeller next to it. We had to feather that. And we got back fine. We landed at another airfield, and I recall it was a long flight. It took a long time, and it took a lot out of us. We landed, we ran out of fuel. 3 engines had no fuel, and we were near the field, and the 4th sputtered out. Well, we were only on 2 engines. The 3rd sputtered out, and then as we landed, the 4th sputtered out. We landed, and they had to drag the plane off the runway. And I was lying under the wing, thoroughly exhausted, didn't want to talk to anybody. And the commanding officer of that field came out, looked at me, looked at the plane. He said, "We're not going to lose this war." And I remember D-Day. On D-Day, our group, like others, flew 3 missions, early in the morning, afternoon, and at dusk. I led the mission at dusk. And as we flew over the channel, we looked down and saw thousands of ships in an armada down there. It was so thrilling. And one of the crew, we had discipline. You're not allowed to talk on the intercom unless it was very important. But one of the crew started to pray, and we all joined in. And after D-Day, I flew on a mission as command pilot. I became squadron commander of the 350 Squadron. And as command pilot, we led a mission to Nuremberg. And over Nuremberg, a plane was hit. We ultimately lost 3 engines and couldn't return to our base. And we were over France, and we crash landed in France. And unfortunately, there was a tree and a bank, a little canal bank there. And we hit the bank, and the plane toppled over, and all 4 officers were hurt seriously. None of the enlisted men were hurt. And I passed out. I thought I heard some French voices. And the next thing I knew, I was in a hospital in Oxford, England, and where I remained for 5 weeks. I had very serious head injuries and face injuries. My mouth was cut up. I broke my right arm. My leg had been gashed in several places. And I forgot to tell you, before that mission, Jeffrey was down at the flight line. I came down to the flight line without a hat. He said, "Where's your hat?" I said, "Somebody took it at the officers' club last night. I don't have a hat." He said, "Here, Rosie, you take my hat. It's a lucky hat." Well, you know what happened. We were shot down. So, while I was in the hospital at Oxford, down the hall comes Jeffrey with 3 other people from the 100th Bomb Group. And I thought he was going to say, "Rosie, where's my hat?" But instead he came over greeted me, hugged me, and he had a gallon of ice cream. Our PX guy, Al Paul, was notorious for doing things. I think he swapped the Jeep with the Navy and got an ice cream machine. And I was the hero of the hospital because I dispensed ice cream at that time. And Jeffrey never asked me about the hat. I returned to the base after 5 weeks, and I couldn't fly. My arm was had been in the sling. I had no power in my arm. I couldn't fly, and I was assigned to the 13th Bomb Wing, where General Hugnam was. And I was there about 3 weeks, and I didn't like it. I didn't feel as though I was contributing. I was assigned to be the operations officer. And I went to see General Hugnam, and I asked to be reassigned to the 100th, and he was nice enough to send me back. And I returned as the squadron commander of the 418th Squadron. And the next interesting mission, I guess, was the one on February 3rd, 1945. On that mission, our group led the 3rd Bomb Division. There were 1,000 planes in the air, one of the biggest raids on Berlin during the war. And I recall that everything went so smoothly. We assembled at our checkpoint, Splasher 6 it was called. It was over the wash. We circled. We used to fire flares, and the planes would join the formation one at a time. They each had a designated spot in the group to fly formation. And as we circled, slowly the planes gathered into the group. And once the group was gathered, we had to pick up the other 2 groups in our wing as we were leading the entire 3rd Division. And then we had to pick up the other planes from the other wings in the division. And as we headed out, we had to pick up the fighter escort. And all of that went so smoothly. It was a beautiful day. The sun was shining, and everything went smoothly. And we approached the target. It was a beautiful sight. You saw these streams of what are those called? The streams of, I can't think of the term now. And it was a very thrilling sight, and we approached the target, Berlin. And as we approached, the plane was hit. Our plane was hit. We had fire on the plane. There were 2 dead on the plane. We continued and bombed the target and turned the lead over to our deputy leader because we were in serious difficulty. We couldn't fly the plane at all. And I headed east because we were briefed that the Russians had crossed the Vistula and were heading toward Germany, toward the Oder River. Knowing that we couldn't return to our base, we headed eastward. And I found out 40 years later that the pilot, John Ernst, a superb lead pilot, his whole crew were superb. John Ernst, I had everybody bail out. I stayed at the controls. And when John went out, he went out the bomb bay doors and he gashed his leg. And at a reunion 40 years later, he told me that he was taken to a Russian field hospital and had his leg amputated without the benefit of anesthesia. They gave him some vodka. And then he told me that one of the crew had been lynched. He came out of the plane, his parachute caught in a tree, and he was lynched by German civilians. And a few were picked up by the Germans and were prisoners of war. I ultimately met two others in the crew who came out with me. When the crew had bailed out, I tried to get out. The plane was, there was smoke and fire in the plane, and I knew how to get out. I couldn't fly the plane, I couldn't land the plane, I couldn't do anything with it. And plane was in the spin. I was pinned down by the centrifugal force, and I had to fight my way, force my way up front, where there was at least one dead, and toward the hatch opening there, and force my way out. And when I got out, I thought I was in heaven. I was away from the plane, the smoke, the noise, and it was suddenly quiet and peaceful in the air, and suddenly I hit the ground. And when I hit the ground, I saw 3 soldiers approaching me. And one of them, when he came close, lifted his gun and was about to strike me. And I noticed that they had red stars on their hat. And I yelled, "Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, Lucky Strike, Coca-Cola, and Bomb in Berlin." And they stopped and recognized that I was American. And with that, they helped me up and hugged me and took care of me, took me to a Russian field hospital. My arm had been broken again. I landed very hard, and they put a cast on there. And they took us to what was sort of a farmhouse, and there was a woman who took care of us and fed us. We called her Hamburger Hannah, because she fed us hamburgers, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I'm sure it was horse meat. And we got tired of it. But she treated us very well. And we finally, I came down with reaction to penicillin that the Russians had given me. I broke out into hives. It was very impure, I guess. And I ended up in a hospital. It was a former German hospital, and stayed there for about 5 days. And ultimately, there was an Air Force. I was brought into Poland. It was a Russian Air Force unit, and they invited us to their field. They heard that I was a major and that I had just been shot down. And I didn't know it, but the Russians men used to dance together, and they had vodka. It was the worst vodka it was like gasoline. It was a GI issue for the Russians. I had never drunk before. I didn't drink during the war, but I had to drink there. And we ended up by dancing together and being very dizzy. And I remember they put us up at night on boards over 2 wooden horses. And one of the wooden horses was lower than the other. And in the course of the evening, we rolled down. We would lay in one heap on the floor. But it was a great occasion. And from there, they took me to a town in Poland. And I could see Posen being under rocket fire at night. It was a very imposing sight. And as we traveled, we saw one camp after another with barbed wire around it. I don't know who these people were behind it, but the devastation was terrible. For the first time, I really saw the war. I had been in England. I had seen Coventry, which had been destroyed, and it turned my stomach. And the East End of London, which had been hit by the Germans. And that really affected me no end. But what I saw in Poland was even worse than that. The damage was incredible. And they ultimately took me to a place to stay with the mayor of a town. And he put me up. It was a nice little home. put me in a room that hadn't been used in 5 years. And it was ice cold. This was in February. And all night long, I shivered in that place. I really shivered. But they were nice to me, you know. They took care of me. That was all they could offer. And the mayor came to me in a few days and said, he spoke English, Major, we're out of food. We've given you our food. Could you approach the Russian general and ask him for food? And I said, of course. Well, I went with him to see the Russian general, a big burly guy, sitting behind a huge desk and staring down at us. And in order to get our message out, I would say something in English, and the Polish mayor spoke English and Polish. So we had to get somebody who could speak Polish and Russian. So there was another interpreter there. So I would get up and speak, and then the Polish mayor would speak, and then this other interpreter would get up and speak. And as he approached the Russian general, he would bow. And every time he did that, his rear end hit me and pushed me back a little. Well, I was irritable and no way ready to get along with that. So the third time he did that, I booted him onto the desk of the Russian general, and with that, the Russian general started to laugh, and he said, Amerikansky. And then he took care of us and gave us the food we wanted. I was ultimately flown into Moscow and had lunch with Averil Harriman and his daughter, and they arranged for a news conference. And they had all the newsmen there who were in Russia. And I sent a telegram back to my mother to say I was all right. It seems that while I was in Russia, my sister had intercepted a telegraph to my mother saying that I was missing in action. And she hadn't told my mother. She was afraid my mother would have cracked up. And my telegram came, and they were delighted by that. And I also sent a telegram to General Partridge, the then commander of the 3rd Bond Division, said, save my job, I'm coming back. And we stayed there for 5 days. We went to the opera in our shabby clothes, in our flight suits. And I recall there was the Japanese ambassador at the opera house. And I had to restrain one of the crew who was furious that there was a Japanese man there. He wanted to attack him. We ultimately talked him out of that. And I was flown from, the 3 of us were flown from Moscow to Poltava to, I think it was Kharkov, to Tehran, to Cairo, to Tunisia, to Athens, to Naples, and back home. When I got back home, I became squadron leader of the 418th Squadron. And Red Bowman greeted me. He was the intelligence officer at the field, and he said, Rosie, you're not very smart. He said, we had put you in for a Congressional Medal of Honor, which you would have had posthumously. And here you came back and you spoiled it all. All you're getting is a Distinguished Service Cross. I was happy to get that, and not anything posthumously. And the war came to an end. I think I flew one more time after that. I remember when the war did come to an end, we flew into Poland, I think, to pick up French prisoners of war and fly them back to France. And they were huddled in the plane. I decided that I would give them a treat. When we got over near Paris, I said, oh, what the heck. We flew off our course and circled Paris, and I told them, we're over Paris. And with that, they all regurgitated, and the plane smelled badly. It was a bad thing on my part to do. And finally the war ended, and I received my orders to go home. And it seemed the day I was to go home, I went down to the group headquarters and picked up my orders. And General Partridge had ordered a parade that day because we had nothing to do. The war had ended, and these guys had worked day and night, and now they were going to have a parade to install discipline. So as I was walking up the hill to my quarters, down the hill came my squadron with their shirts billowing out, completely out of step. And I really laughed to myself. And as I went by them, one sergeant turned to me and he said, "Rosie, you would leave when things get tough." I went back to my quarters, and I thought then that I would never see anybody in the group again. I didn't know what the future would hold. And I was sad, and I went home, and I had been assigned to be the operations officer of the transport command. And I decided that with my background in combat, I could do more good by flying combat against the Japanese until the war ended. So I went to Washington and saw General Anderson. I happen to know the man who piloted him, Frank Laurel. And I asked General Anderson to reassign me, and he did, to MacDill Field to take up B-29 flight. And while I was there, the war ended, and I came home. And when I came home, I went back to work at the same firm that I had been with. And now Franklin Roosevelt Jr. was there, and a couple of other people. And I was not ready really to go back to work. I was more tired than I thought. I hadn't taken any time off. I'd flown into my third tour. I didn't realize how fatigued I was. And finally, after being there for 6 months, I heard about an opportunity to go to Nuremberg as a prosecutor. And I went to Washington, and I signed up there to be a prosecutor. And one day we were to meet in Brooklyn at the pier for orientation. And I was sitting next to another lawyer who I didn't know. And in walked this beautiful girl. And I said, "Wow, who is she?" He said, "Would you like to meet her?" And I said, "Yes." And he introduced me to her. And she gave me a cold shoulder like I've never had before. And that was the end of that. A week later, we were to sail on the good ship E.B. Alexander for Bremerhaven. And the ship was to leave at 2 p.m. Well, if you're in the military, you know you're not going to leave at 2 p.m. At 5 o'clock, they were getting ready to leave, and down the pier came this girl on a forklift sitting on top of a baggage. And as they were about to pull up the gangplank, she leaped on board. They threw her bags on board. And that evening, all the prosecutors met on board deck, and we started to introduce each other. And I got up and I said, "My name is Bob Rosenthal." And with that, this girl who had given me the cold shoulder, who happened to be Phyllis Heller, who I ultimately married, came over to me and said, "Oh, you're Bob Rosenthal." She had met a Columbia law graduate of hers who had been in her class, who had been in the same law firm that I had, and he had told her about me. And we were on board ship for 10 days, and we were engaged 10 days later. We spent all of our time together. And we got to Nuremberg, and we were ultimately, well, in Nuremberg, we couldn't get married right away because we were in a military-occupied country. Even though we were civilians, we were under military rule. And the military had an order that if you wanted to marry, you had to get permission. The reason for it was very simple. Many soldiers, many of our GIs would go overseas and meet somebody, some girl that they didn't know, and they were lonely and they'd want to marry right away. And I remember we had one pilot come over. He had a wife and a young baby, and he put the baby's booties in the cockpit, had it hang like you do sometimes in a car. And within a couple of weeks, he met an English girl and he wanted to marry her. Well, we kept putting that off and putting it off until he finished his tour and sent him home, and he'd never got a divorce. He went back to his wife. So we had to get permission from the military. And we finally got permission 6 weeks later, which said that this marriage will not bring discredit to the armed forces. And we were married before the Burgermeister in on September 14th, 1946. My wife, Phyllis, spoke German. I didn't. And the Burgermeister spoke German, and he said something to her, and she said, jawohl, and he said something to me. And I'm not about to say jawohl unless I know what it's all about. So he repeated that 3 times, and now there was an electricity in the air. So finally, when he repeated it once more, my best man gave me a shove with his elbow, and he said jawohl, and I maintained that he married Phyllis and I didn't. But we stayed there.
Sorry, can you pull up? I've just got to change tapes.
Okay. I don't know whether I'm covering anything for you.
Oh, no. Fascinating.
I left out a lot, but I'm trying to get through it